Okay, I think we're set. Apologies for the technical difficulties there today. Alrighty, so today we're going to finish our look through UI Kit. So over, here, or not over here, but, what you're currently seeing, and actually let me go ahead and I'll maximize this for now so we have the most space we can get. But I will also zoom in a bit on the text. This is the Class 7 assignment example. So basically your previous assignment, which was to create a UI for the Counters app, this is a potential implementation for it that I sent out to you all on Tuesday. So today we're going to kind of work around and play in this and mess around with it to kind of get a feel for the different things that you can do with UIKit as well from what we've already learned. And then your assignment that's coming up that will span across spring break will be to make this app a little bit more advanced than it currently is, using some of the techniques that I'll be showing you today. So, to start with, we're going to be looking at some more advanced things that you can do with constraints than we have done previously. So, for example, if we go down here, we can take a look at our constraints, right? So we know that we have, say, the, it would be nice if I could click like specific elements, but I can't. Oh well. So we know that we have, for example, our H stack here. And if we'll recall, the H stack is essentially, these buttons and also the label and the spinner, essentially, right? And that is here, decrement, counter label, counter activity, and increment, right? And these increment and decrement are, UI buttons that I made previously, right? So one thing that we can do that we haven't really looked at too much, right, is something like less than or equal to, okay? So this is here in this example just because I can't leave a UI like, in a bad way, right? But if you were to set this to equal to, okay, then it would do this. It would spread itself way out, right? Because it is trying to make sure that this horizontal stack, and I'm going to go ahead and also make this have a red background just so it's very clear what we're talking about. Like that. So this horizontal stack is essentially being spread all the way to the edges, right? To the layout margins, right? So those are the margins of the view. Okay, so you get a little bit of space on the side there, which is nice, but it just doesn't look great, right? So one thing that you can do to kind of handle this, right, is this equal to so for some of the constraints, some kinds of constraints like center X anchor, I think, has one. Let's take a look. No, it doesn't. Is it the top ones? Well, whatever. There's oh, here it is. Yeah. You can apply constants, right? And then you can make the constants be reference the, height values, right? So they're kind of, in that way they are related to one another, right? So if the height of the view here changes, then then the center Y anchor position of the session label will change, right? This session label, right? So, yeah. Top anchor. Sorry, I'm just trying to remember everything that I had here. Session labels, center Y, blah, blah, blah. Right. Okay, yeah. Yeah. Or here, for example, we have this top anchor constraint equal to hstack.bottom anchor constant 25, right? If we didn't have this constant, right, then this would, that space would disappear. There wouldn't be any space. So the constant gives us a little bit of space, right? And if you wanted it to overlap, you could always use negative 25. I don't know why you'd ever do that. Don't do that, but you could if you really wanted to. Oop, there we go. But one thing that you can do is you can have conditional, or not conditional constraints, but constraints that kind of are less constrained. They're a little loosey-gooseier, okay? These are like the ones that we've been using thus far are sort of hard and fast rules, right? They say, oh, you have to be this size, or you have to be at this position in relation to someone else, right? What you can do instead, and this was kind of alluded to, I kind of ruined my own talk for you guys by having this in here already, but there is a type of constraint that you can have, okay, called greater than or equal to or less than or equal to, okay? And these types of constraints basically allow you to say things like, yeah, I want this constraint, I want this thing to be, at this size or lower, right? And then you tell Autolayout, you're basically telling Autolayout, feel free to resize it down as much as you want if it's less than or equal to that you're using from this size. So it can never be larger than this size. If you're using greater than or equal to, you're saying it can never be smaller than this size. It has to be this size at minimum, right? Or position, right? That's the other thing. You can use these for some positions as well. So in this case, if we make this equal to the less than or equal to the view dot width anchor, and it's needs one of these, right? What this tells Autolayout is that the HStack's width, right, the width of our stack view here, does not need to be it has no minimum size. It has a maximum size, the maximum it could be, and if the views that you shove into that HStack make it wider than those constraints allow, then you'll get some weird kind of it'll kind of squish things down and try and keep them within, right? And it'll do things called breaking constraints, which can lead to all sorts of weirdness, so try and avoid it. But because we're saying less than or equal to, we're basically saying, hey, the width is kind of variable, right? It can, as long as it's less than the width anchor, we don't care. And what that does is it makes the HStack say, oh, okay, cool. I'll be as small as I possibly can be, right? And then it basically looks to the views within it to determine what size it should be, right? Because it's a stack view, right? And that's kind of how stack views work, right? They kind of expand to fit the size of whatever's inside of them. So, so you can do this less than or equal to for width, right? If we wanted to say maybe, have this kind of no counter selected thing, right? Be able to kind of float based on phone size, right? As just say like, oh, as long as it's like, at least 50 points away from the bottom, we don't really care where it is, in terms of like that constraint at least, right? Other constraints might say otherwise, right? So like, for example, we could say, let's see here. So we've got our center Y anchor is what we've set this to, right? So let's go ahead and turn that off. And it's going to go flying up there because that was how it knew its Y position, right? So let's go ahead and change this to be session label dot bottom anchor dot constraint, right? And we'll say greater than or equal to with a constant. We'll say our layout margins dot bottom, right? Because we want it to match up to the bottom, and we want it to be at least 50 pixels away, right? So it'll always be 50 pixels or more away from the bottom, right? That said, 50 pixels, if you'll recall, we start in the top left, right, for our coordinate system, and positive goes down in the Y direction, right? Which means, for this case, we actually want this to be negative 50, right? So it needs to be greater than or equal to the bottom anchor negative 50. And actually, I think if we make that less than, that might work better. This is one of those, now I'm like, oh, I don't know, and you're going to get to see me like, experiment like live, right? Yeah, I think that'll work. Yeah. Yep. So anyway, we'll switch it back to greater than, because I'm pretty sure that's correct, right? So as long as we are at least negative 50 away from the bottom anchor, right, then this is great, right? That constraint can be any size greater, right? Like it could be like negative 25, I think, or negative 50 or whatever, or sorry, negative like 0, right? Which actually I guess it would be less than. I think less than or equal to is more correct, actually. Sorry. So, yeah. And this is one of those things where usually when I was dealing with less than and greater than, I was doing it in Storyboard back in the day. So apologies. Doing it in my head, I'm like, man, I wish I could see the constraints, in here, right? But I can't. So, okay. So we're gonna say this, less than or equal to, right? And you can even drop the constant too, right? And it'll look okay, right? And I think if you do greater than or equal to, it'll be in the same position. Yeah. So it's just basically trying to match up the bottom anchor to that as best it can. And unless it has something else, some other constraint modifying it, it will kind of try and get them as equal as possible, right? But right now, let's take a look at kind of tugging on it and seeing what happens, right? That'll tell us if it needs to be greater than or equal to or less than or equal to, right? So if we set the the session label's top anchor right now is set to the H-stack's bottom anchor with a distance of 25. Cool, great. Okay, let's take a look at our H-stack. So our H-stack currently has a height, it currently has a width, and it currently has an X position, okay? So it is basically gathering its own Y position. It's understanding its Y position in reference to this constraint, right? Because this session label is able to figure out a Y position that matches all of its constraints, that means that the the H stack is able to find a Y position that matches all of its constraints, because it knows, oh, I don't know where I should be, except I know I should be at least 25 points away from the top anchor of the session label. And that's it. That's all I know, right? But if we wanted to say, I don't know, put this so that the top anchor of the H stack is 70 points exactly from the bottom of the start button, right? So we'll look at top anchor.constraint equal to, and now we'll do this, where's the equal to, here we go, equal to constant. And we're going to make this equal to the start button, which is, where's that? Just want to make sure I have the right name for it. Where are you, start button? You're around here somewhere, I know it. Oh, have you not been made yet? You have not. Okay, cool, that's fine. We're going to move this constraint down there. So sometimes you'll have to do some of your constraints broken up a little bit. Depends, right? You just need, you need all of the things added to the stack, added to the view hierarchy when you create the constraint, right? So if we want to constrain to the button, we need to wait until the button's there first, right? So now we're going to make this equal to the button, and we will say 70. Actually, I'm going to say 75. That's a much nicer number, right? And obviously this is not just button, it's going to be the button's bottom anchor, right? Okay, so this one just got pulled down, right? This just got snapped down, right? And the reason for that is that the center Y anchor is currently set to this, right? And the constraints basically broke. So if you have conflicting constraints Autolayout will pick one and break it. They'll just say, oh, these rules don't match up. We'll find the minimum amount of rules we can break to make them match and then just break it. And it won't tell you, it'll just break it, right? You'll see it happen, right? And that's what happened here, right? So looking at that, we can now go back and say, oh, okay, so this should probably be, where is it? Yes. So this should probably be less than or equal to, not greater than or equal to, right? And there you go, right? So because we're saying less than or equal to for the bottom, and this matches with my understanding of the y coordinates, so that works out. Because as y goes down, right, it grows. So we're saying that the bottom anchor of our session label here, okay, can be, right, and the bottom anchor is a position, so it's like y equals, whatever, right? That value can be less than the layout margin's bottom anchor, which is something like, 1024 or whatever, right? So we're saying it can be anything less than that, right? And so because we now have another constraint kind of tugging upwards through this H stack, right? Now this kind of, stretchy kind of, nebulous constraint is allowed to just stretch as much as it wants, right? You can do all sorts of weird stuff with this, right? You can basically create like, oh, the top is greater than or equal to 50 and the bottom is greater than or equal to 50, and then it'll float somewhere in between, right? However, if you make it too ambiguous, using greater than or equal to or less than or equal to, what you end up doing is creating a state where Autolayout can't figure out where to draw your UI view. So it just kind of freaks out and doesn't. And it breaks constraints to try and fix it. But yeah, basically, there's all sorts of kind of weird, fun stuff you can do with this. But it's kind of, if you want something to be able to float, right, and kind of move around based on other things happening on the screen, one way you can do it is using greater than or equal to or less than or equal to in your constraints. The other way you can do it, as we have seen before, is with the stack view, right? So the stack view is basically a way to handle a lot of this sort of stuff that constraints handle without having to worry about it too much, okay? Stack view is, it was added well after Autolayout was in the library, right? But at the end of the day, it kind of sort of does most of what you want to do with Autolayout. So we're going to look at how to basically transfer this entire view into using just stack views to render stuff in the way that we're looking at, right? In this same sort of way, okay? So to start with, we already have one H stack view right here, right? Now, looking at this, the way it's kind of set up, this looks like this whole thing, everything's kind of this, then this, then this. That looks like a vertical stack view to me, right? There's some spacing and stuff, but we can figure that out as we go. So let's go ahead and look at it and say we're gonna put everything into a vertical stack view. Now I believe we already have one stack view. Yes. So we already have a one stack view for the namespace, key, and button, right? We also have this weird spacer thing. Don't worry about it too much. We're going to be looking at that also. So we have our stack view here, right? Let's go ahead and just kind of put everything else into this. So we're going to kill all these constraints. Well, some of these constraints. We'll just comment them out, right? And then you'll see this all kind of goes over here and acts a little weird, right? And then we're going to find where we add things to the subview. We're going to remove it because we're going to be adding it to the stack view instead. Oh no, it freaked out, right? And that's, I think, because there's still a, yeah. We still had a constraint on that down there, right? And we crashed the preview because we tried to apply a constraint to two views that are not in the same view hierarchy, right? So let's just make sure. I think we've got everything. This is the other one. Here we go. Session label. Okay, so we've got our session label, counter label, counter label, counter activity, and all that is inside the H stack, actually. So it's just the session label and the H stack that we need to add, right? So let's get to our stack here, and we will add our H stack and our session label, right? Cool. It looks great, right? Not really, right? Stacks don't completely fix everything, you know? That would be nice, but they don't, right? So some things that you'll want to consider, right, as a part of doing this, right? There are a number of properties on stack that impact stuff like this, right? Like there's this concept called alignment, which depending on if you're a vertical or a horizontal stack view determines, you know, what justification does it set everything to, right? So basically, you know, we can set this to leading, right, which tries to shrink everything into the leading spot, right? We could set it to center, right, which shrinks everything to the center spot, okay? We could set it to fill, right, which is what you saw before. That's the default, right, where it tries to kind of expand them out and fill using, you know, what it's got, right? This is the closest to what we want because namespace, key, and start are all correct. It's really just our horizontal stack that's kind of messed up. So let's look at something else, right? If we look at distribution, right, this has this, you know, whole equal spacing, fill equally, fill proportionally, right? I believe fill is the default, but like if we wanted to do, like if we did fill proportionally, none of these are going to yield a different result for us because almost all of these views are basically the same height. The distribution matters more for the direction that the stack view is going. So if it's vertical, it cares about height. If it's horizontal, it cares about width. And that tells us, oh, okay, well, let's go look at the H stack, right? The H stack has this fill proportionally, okay, set. So what if we set this instead to fill equally? Oh, that looks a little better, right? And what this is doing is basically setting it so that each of the subviews, each of its arranged subviews, gets equal space within it, right? So you don't see anything here because currently the counter label doesn't have anything in it. But if we were to just go here and put like 100 here, right, then there's that, right? And you could even, if we wanted to really make it super clear what's happening, right, you can make that green. And you can see there's a little space where you can see our red, you know, background for our H stack now. And that's because we've set our spacing to 10. Spacing automatically puts space in between all of the items, right? Otherwise, if the spacing is set to 0, then there's absolutely no space in between. They're right up on each other, right? I think the default spacing is like 4, something like that, if you don't set it, you know? Like it's not 0. Oh, I guess it is. Well, it depends. Okay, that's a different thing. It depends, like fill equally versus proportionally or whatever. So we can take a look at a few of these others, right? There's equal spacing, okay? And this tries to make sure that the spacing in between them all is equal, but it kind of shrinks them as much as you can. Not exactly what we want, right? There's equal centering, okay? And this tries to make sure that they're like, you know, Y position is all exactly the same. Kind of not really what we want either, right? So if we just do fill, regular fill, then you get this kind of weirdness here. And what this is a result of basically kind of a quote-unquote greedy policy where essentially it's just letting the first view take up as much space as it can. And the remaining views are all just sort of struggling to keep themselves like it's like, hey, this is my minimum size. Okay, I have to be this size, right? They don't have any constraints saying that. They're inferring that based on their content, right? Except for, I think, the session label have a constraint? I don't think so. No. Yeah, cool. Yeah, good. So there's fill, and then fill equally and fill proportionally, which kind of tries to do what we're looking for, but doesn't really succeed, right? So, you know, what do we do? How do we handle this, right? This situation that we find ourselves in. Essentially, we already looked at that one, right? Yeah. What you can do is you can set your sort of width constraints for these items, right? So if we go to increment dot width anchor dot constraint equal to 50, something like that, right? Oh, sorry, I meant decrement, not increment, right? Then it kind of shrinks it down, right? And now the automatic thing, fill, right? Okay, this is starting to look a little bit better, right? It's not exactly there, but it's looking it, right? You can also then, we can do the same for increment just to make sure they're kind of the same, right? But then if we set that for the session, or not session label, sorry, the counter label, which I think is just called counter label. Yep. Counter label dot width dot constraint equals to 50, right? You get some weird stuff. It just starts to break stuff again, right? And that's because the stack view tries to fill itself completely when it is set to fill, right? So when it has a fill thing, right, then it needs to set, it wants to make sure that at least something is all the way on the left side and at least something is all the way on the right side. If you switch this to equal spacing, it's still doing the same thing. Even if it's not set to a fill, it's always trying to do that, right? So one solution when you're dealing with stack views, there's kind of two kind of thoughts about how to go about this, about how to make this work correctly, right? And we'll set that to 100 just because. You can either wrap your stack that's inside of a stack. You can wrap it inside of a view and then set constraints within that view, right? So that view that the H stack is in, that view will be set to, the width, right? And then from within there, you can then set your edge constraints, right? Unfortunately, if you were to try to do that just to the stack view, right? So if we were to say leading anchor dot constraint, and here we'll say, greater than or equal to the H stack dot leading anchor, and we'll give it a constant and say 50, right? We want to have a space of 50 here, right? You can get that exact thing, right? And so now it's kind of gone over, right? And this 50 basically is saying, the space can be kind of 50 or more, right? So this is that sort of, idea of like kind of just treat the stack view as a kind of enclosing view, and then you can set up your constraints, right? Once again, though, we're using constraints, right? Which is kind of like not really what we were looking for, right? But it is definitely one way you can do it. So you can also do increment dot trailing dot constraint, and then this is going to be greater than or equal to H stack dot trailing constant 50, right? And comma, like so, right? Oh, and this one actually needs to be less than because we are on the far end and we want to get smaller. And I think negative 50 as well. Yeah. This is one of those situations where I would actually go to I'd go to the storyboard and I'd just mess around to try and get it right, because sometimes, man, doing constraints in code is just such a nightmare compared to doing it here. They were basically built to be done with a user interface, right? So let's go ahead and try this out again. So we're gonna create a stack. Right, we'll put a stack in here. Cool, great. Hello stack. You're gonna be set to here and here. We will set you centered in the container. We will set your leading and trailing to be 0 and 0, like so. And we'll set your height to be something like 300, right? And then it'll be happy. It'll stop yelling. Okay, cool. So now it's fully constrained. It knows where it is and what it's going to have in it, right? Or what its size is going to be. So now let's go ahead and add, I believe we had 2 buttons, and here, let's make this smaller because we're dealing with a smaller screen. So we had 2 buttons, right? then another one in here, and then we have a label in between them, like so, right? So we've got our stack here. Okay, cool. You know, this is our H stack. And then this is also within a vertical stack. That's the other thing. So let's go ahead and add another stack like so. I realize now that I should have done this one as the first one that was constrained, but whatever, it's fine. So we will set our constraints, and this one will just set to be fully constrained to the margins. And when you do that, you know, you're typically just fine. And then we need to delete some of these constraints, because yeah. Okay, cool. So here's our stack view, cool. And now we can add a bunch of other, you know, cruft to this, like some labels, right? Just stuff on either side, you know, to make sure that it's not just all by itself, right? And then a text field. Like this, right? Cool. Okay. So now we'll make sure that our stack view here has a, excuse me, we'll do like fill equally, I think, right? And so this will just kind of smear everything into the same width, right? Whatever, no big deal. That's not exactly what we're looking at. We're trying to look at how to kind of shrink this in, right? So here now we're going to look at this button here, right? And we had these, I believe, set to a width of 50, right? So we'll do that for that one. We'll do it for this one. Okay. We had the label set to a width of 100, and this will make it yell because those constraints are inconsistent. Oh, no, I see. That's interesting. I thought that you were set to constrain to the trailing to the bottom. Here's the, yeah, trailing. Okay, fun, love that. That's fine. We can instead set the width. So another thing you can do while we're in here, if you select two views, then your options in here change. So you can have two views and you can say, oh, let's go ahead and make sure that their leading edges are lined up or their trailing edges, right? Or that they have equal widths, right? So yeah. Again, we've set this to be an equal width, but it's conflicting with something else. So not sure what that is. I love this stuff. It's my favorite thing ever, can you tell? Constraints are just fun, right? So, because constraints are so fun, and we're having trouble figuring out exactly how we would get, you know, this to constrain correctly, right? In order so that like just the button and the label and stuff can just be small, right? And not be spread out all the way to the edge of the stack view, right? That's kind of what we're trying to do. That's our goal, right? So let's go in here. Let's delete the offending constraints. This one and this one and this one, right? So what you can do instead is just add empty views that have a particular width, right? So you can call these spacers, basically. There's no specific spacer view type or anything like that, right? But let me just make sure this is just fill. Yep, cool. So now we can set the constraints here. Let's make it like width is like, I don't know, 200 or something like that. Oh, that's too much. We'll edit that here. We'll make it 100, right? And then this one, we will give it a constraint of 100 width, right? And so now it's kind of shrunk these in, right? And so that's how you get that. And then also if we wanted to make this small instead of spread out across the whole thing, we could go to the bottom, and instead of equal, we can modify this to be greater than, or sorry, less than or equal to that, and that should snap it up, but it's not doing it because Xcode loves to make me look stupid in front of you guys. So, right, but storyboards, they're tough. If we go back into here, basically what we want to do is we want to have some spacer views, right? So let's go ahead and create leading spacer equals UI view, and trailing spacer equals UI view, right? And so now we'll put leading spacer here, trailing spacer here, okay? And then in here, let me get this out of the way too, so that it's not like all word wrapped everywhere. We can get rid of this trailing, get rid of this leading, right? So we've got these, right? And now we can go to hstack.distribution, and then we want to do, I think, equal centering. Yes. So if we set equal centering, then we get something that looks a lot more like what we were looking for, right? It's still not quite exactly it. You'll note that this space is larger than 10, right? If you did something like equal spacing, right? Also still not quite. You could do fill proportionally, right? That's still, not exactly what we're looking for, right? If you really want to be like kind of very, hella specific with it, right? Then you can get the leading spacer and set its width, right? Like that. Always forget the commas, right? So if we make that 50, for example, right? And then you can do the same with the trailing spacer. Boop. Like so. And that looks pretty good, right? That's kind of what we were going for. So anyway, this has been constraints and stacks and stack views for, kind of slightly more advanced kind of how to, put stuff. Another thing of note is that you can put stack views within stack views. We've done that here with like a horizontal inside of a vertical. You can also put verticals inside of verticals, and you can stack them many, many layers deep. So you can get stacks within stacks within stacks, right? So if you can think of a way to kind of, break up your, your layout, right, for your screen into a bunch of different stacks and stuff, have at it, right? And then if you need a bunch of extra space in between stuff, like let's say we wanted this counter now, let's say we wanted this back near the bottom again, right? How would we do that? We'd probably put a spacer here, right? So we could create another, we'll call this counter spacer by view, right? We will add counter spacer after, and the counter spacer actually goes down to the vertical stack, which is going to be here. And you'll note we actually already have a spacer here. That's why these aren't all the way up to the top, right? So we've got our button, and then we will have our counter spacer, and then the H stack and whatnot. And we will add a constraint on our counter spacer's height to make it a certain size, right? And you could make this 100, you could make it, equal to view.bounds, right, dot height over 4, a quarter of the height, right, stuff like that. You'll also note that, this is kind of now sliding off the top, right? And that's because our stacks center Y is what we're setting rather than its top, right? So instead of this, you might want to do something like stack.top_anchor.constraint equals to view.margin top anchor, right? Right. That'll keep it there, right? And then you can also make this greater than or equal to, right? And that'll allow it to kind of, go further. And you can even set this to a constant of 50 to give it at least stay 50 away. And then you can be any amount you want from there, right? Likewise, we could have this height constraint be greater than or equal to constant this, right? And so basically it'll be able to float, up to or greater than that amount, right? I think if you set this to like that, it would go off the edge, yeah. So, yeah. And it will try to get as close to that value as possible unless it has something else kind of pulling it further away, which because it's in a stack, inside of a stack, it does not. And I think we can also look at if we wanted to add some more disgusting colors, we could go to purple for the back, right? It's like, oh, that's why it's not going to the bottom, because the stack isn't going to the bottom, right? So let's go ahead and set our stack bottom anchor to view.margin bottom anchor. That should stretch it. There you go, right? So, yeah. And then here we can have this be 6 instead, something like that. Or, oh, I guess it doesn't even, this doesn't even matter now, right? Yeah. Oh, that's right. It pushes it up. Okay. Anyway, yeah, I hope that this has been helpful rather than confusing. However, because it is constraints, it was probably more confusing than helpful. Next up, we're going to be looking, after the 10-minute break that we're about to have, we're going to look at creating our own custom UI views and navigation, and how you navigate between different screens in your application. So, yeah. But for now, 10-minute break. How do I